In our story today, Paul and Barnabas are just getting started in their ministry. We began in chapter 13 with a brief overview of their commissioning, but from there we jumped to chapter 14, where already the Jewish authorities are trying to shut them down. The authorities in Iconium are furious with Paul and Barnabas, who have been telling people that the Jewish laws and even the Jewish synagogue are no longer relevant. No more circumcision, they tell people, no more sacrifices, and no more dietary laws. You can eat as much bacon as you want. And the message is well received because after all, who doesn't love bacon? Okay, well, maybe it wasn't so much about the bacon, but the message was certainly popular. Because the message of the gospel is a message of inclusion rather than exclusion. In those days, the Jewish synagogue entertained so many strict rules and employed such a complex hierarchical structure that many were left out. And not just Gentiles, but poor Jewish people who couldn't afford the right sacrifices or who were forced to work on the Sabbath. But the gospel message opened wide the circling warmth of God's love for all of God's creation. And you didn't even have to do anything to earn it. Even better, followers looked out for one another. They took care of the widows and the orphans. It was a message that was particularly compelling to those not situated in the upper tiers of society. So this gospel message, as we would say today, was going viral. People were coming in droves to listen to Paul and Barnabas speak, creating quite a stir in Iconium, and the Jewish authorities became threatened to the point that they began plotting to stone Paul and Barnabas. So when Paul and Barnabas learn about this plot, they flee to a tribal village in the nearby mountains called Lystra, and that is where our story begins today. And this is also where it gets a little weird, and kind of funny too, because when Paul and Barnabas visited the city of Lystra, the people thought they were gods. According to the text, not long after Paul and Barnabas arrived in Lystra, they met a man crippled from birth who could not walk. Paul takes one look at the guy and looks at him intently, and he sees that he has the faith to be healed. So he tells the man, "Stand up straight," and he does. But the reaction of the citizens of Lystra to this miracle was not at all what they were expecting, because the next thing you know, everyone is bowing down to them and calling them Zeus and Hermes. I imagine this was quite a learning experience for Paul and Barnabas. That happens a lot in ministry, especially in the beginning. I mean, just when you think you're starting to get the hang of things, and people are starting to maybe take you just a little bit seriously, that is exactly when everything is most likely to backfire on you. Lystra was different from anywhere else that they had ever been so far. For one thing, there was no synagogue. Lystra was unequivocally Gentile territory. For another thing, no one spoke their language. Lystra was an isolated mountain town where they spoke Lycaonian, an ancient tribal language. And finally, all of the locals worshiped the gods Zeus and Hermes. In fact, a temple to Zeus stood at the front of the city. The inhabitants were big fans. And to make things even more complicated, there was a local legend of that time told by Ovid in his book of Metamorphosis about an old and pious couple who had entertained two strangers one time who turned out to be Zeus and Hermes. This couple was later rewarded for their hospitality, and the people of Lystra were not going to miss out on this opportunity. They were convinced that Zeus and Hermes had returned to earth in the form of the humans one more time, and this time the going to entertain them properly. Well, apparently it was some time before Barnabas and Paul caught on. I kind of like to imagine them congratulating themselves on having just facilitated the healing of a man through the power of Jesus Christ, and then gushing about how receptive everyone seemed to be of that demonstration. When suddenly the local priest of Zeus shows up at the gates of the city with oxen and garlands to offer as a sacrifice. At first, they don't know what's going on, but slowly recognition starts to dawn in their eyes, and they are horrified. What a great story. I love it. Paul and Barnabas perform a Christian miracle that is immediately taken out of their context and put into the context of the Greek legend of the time and place. Why is that a great story? Because it speaks so well to human nature and how sometimes things get so totally snarled up in life. Whenever anything new comes into our lives, it is inevitable that we will interpret it according to what we already know, and the people of Lystra were no exception. And while this confusion is sometimes funny, it can also be pretty painful. Paul and Barnabas are horrified. What are you doing? We're just regular people, the same as you. These two have stepped in it big time, and they know it. So Paul turns on the juice. You should turn away from all of these worthless things to the one God who made the heaven and earth and sea. He tells them there is not a pantheon of gods. There is just the one living God who made the heaven and the earth and all that is in them. And this is the one who has been giving you the rain and food and filling your hearts with joy. And while the people might not have understood a word that he was saying, this is actually pretty good stuff. Paul catches on quick, because now he is appealing to their common human experience rather than traditional religion. He is directing them to what is the source of life. Paul's agile leadership instincts were being put to the test that day. Suddenly, everything that he and Barnabas did and said had to be thought about through the eyes and the ears of total outsiders, people with no knowledge of God or of God's love for them, and no knowledge of God's desire to embrace the world. So it was almost as if they were starting from scratch, except they weren't. Because even if the people of Lystra had only their own Greek mythology through which to interpret God's work, it did not mean that God was not at work. Paul had seen the faith in the eyes of the man who wanted to be healed, and if he had looked deeper, he would have recognized that what they saw in that man's eyes showed that God was already present and active in that place. Paul and Barnabas may have thought they were bringing God with them to Lystra, but what really happened that day was that they met the God who was already there. And this is important because for centuries the church assumed that our missionaries brought God with them to heathen places and heathen people, saving them from lives devoid of the presence of the Holy One. But in the last 50 years or so, we have come to understand what Paul and Barnabas discovered that day in Lystra. God is always already present wherever we go. Our job is not to bring God with us. Our job is to discover God's presence, to notice it, and then interpret it through the lens of what we know in Jesus Christ. Then we can learn together from and with our mission partners what God is up to in that place, allowing whatever we learn to shape and reshape our own theological categories and assumptions and mess with our own blueprints about what church should be. But that's hard, because whenever anything new comes into our lives, it is inevitable that we will interpret it according to what we already know. Which is also the reason for many of the arguments in the Christian church today. many of us simply cannot fathom the possibility that God would ever do anything new in our churches. Someone once said, the greatest obstacle to our experience of God is our last experience with God. In other words, what prohibits us from experiencing God today is yesterday's experience of God. We were so moved by that previous wondrous experience that we get stuck trying to imagine any other way that God might come to us. But when our ears and our eyes are open, God does new things in our lives all the time. God teaches new things about God's self, about what it means to serve God, and about new places where we might follow Jesus, which usually means changing our previous image of who God is. Those transformations are not easy, are they? It's not easy to come to grips with a new thing in our spiritual lives, in our emotional lives, or our theological lives. And many people flat out insist that God remain reliable, steady, and unchanging, which is what Paul was up against much of the time too. As they traveled all over the Mediterranean world preaching a gospel of love and inclusion, there were those who were excited about the message, but there were also those who were threatened by it. Remember that incident in Iconium? That posse was still hot on their tails, along with the original posse from Antioch. In fact, between verses 18 and 19 of our reading today, everything changes in an instant. We aren't told how much time passed, just that a contingent of angry men arrived from Antioch and worked the crowds. And they must have been pretty upset because they traveled more than 100 miles to prevent the work of the apostles, and the results were horrible. Somehow they persuaded the multitudes to stone Paul and drag his body out of the city. But in spite of being stoned and left for dead, Paul was not dead, and his ministry did not end that day in Lystra. He and Barnabas went on to share the good news with many other cities, and thousands believed because of their witness. This story is weird, it's funny, and it speaks brilliantly to human nature and how sometimes things get so darn snarled up in life that you are so sure you have been stoned absolutely to death. But it also points to our need to slow down and listen and receive what is inherently holy and pure in each and every moment. Too often we limit God's presence to the really big events, the healing of the lame, or the cure of stage 4 cancer. But if you really want to see God and see God every day, then look for God in the little things and not the big things. Elizabeth Barrett Browning wrote, "Earth's crammed with heaven, and every common bush afire with God. But only he who sees takes off his shoes. The rest sit around and pluck blackberries." May it be with you all according to God's word. Amen.